October 24, 1944. A Japanese naval pilot named Lieutenant Shiro Nishizawa sat in his cockpit aboard the carrier Zuikaku, staring at a reconnaissance photograph that made no sense. The image showed something floating in the waters off the Philippine island of Samar. Small, boxy vessels that looked more like cargo freighters than warships. His intelligence officer had circled them in red ink and written a single word: negligible. Nishizawa folded the photograph and tucked it into his flight suit, confident that the coming battle would be over before noon. He had no way of knowing that within 72 hours he would be one of the few pilots in his squadron still alive to ask the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What were those ships really carrying? The vessels in that photograph were American escort carriers, and to understand the shock they delivered, you must first understand what every Japanese pilot had been taught to believe about them. In the naval academies of Yokosuka and Etajima, instructors had shown their students detailed silhouettes of American carrier types. The fleet carriers, the Essex class, were marked in red as primary threats. The light carriers received yellow markings as secondary concerns. But the escort carriers, those small, slow conversions built on merchant ship hulls, were marked in green and labeled with a phrase that translated roughly to "not worthy of a torpedo." They were considered so militarily insignificant that attack doctrine suggested they'd be bypassed entirely in favor of more valuable targets. Japanese pilots were taught that these vessels were merely transport ships, ferrying replacement aircraft to rear areas, crewed by inexperienced reservists, and utterly incapable of affecting the outcome of a major naval engagement. This wasn't arrogance. It was the conclusion of Japan's most respected naval strategists, men who had studied warfare their entire lives. And for the first 2 years of the Pacific War, they had been absolutely right, but something had changed in the American industrial heartland, and the evidence of that change was invisible in reconnaissance photographs. In the sprawling Kaiser shipyards of Vancouver, Washington, and the Willamette Iron and Steel Works in Portland, Oregon, a production miracle had been unfolding in silence. These weren't traditional naval shipyards. They were automobile factories and construction companies that had been retooled with stunning speed. Workers who had been building cars and bridges 18 months earlier were now welding flight decks. The escort carriers rolling out of these facilities weren't just being built quickly. They were being mass-produced using assembly line techniques that naval architects had previously considered impossible for warship construction. By the autumn of 1944, the United States was completing one escort carrier every 5 days. Not one per month, not one per week, one every 5 days, with crews trained, aircraft embarked, and full ammunition loads. But the Japanese Naval Command had no intelligence indicating this pace of construction. Their last reliable production estimates were from 1943, and those numbers suggested the Americans might have 20 to 30 escort carriers in service. The actual number in October 1944 was 78, with more launching each week. But even that staggering number wasn't the real revolution. Something else had been loaded into the hangar decks of those ships, something that would rewrite the rules of naval aviation. And Japanese intelligence had completely missed it. Let us return to Lieutenant Nishizawa on that October morning. His squadron of 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters launched from Zuikaku at dawn, tasked with clearing American air cover ahead of Admiral Kurita's powerful surface fleet. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Japanese fighters would sweep aside whatever token air defense the Americans had mustered, allowing Kurita's battleships and cruisers to close and destroy the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. Nishizawa's tactical briefing had estimated they might encounter perhaps 24 American aircraft, probably a mix of older F-4F Wildcats and some F-6F Hellcats from one of the distant fleet carriers. The briefing officer had been quite clear. The small escort carriers visible in the reconnaissance photos would not be a factor. They might launch a few planes, but escort carrier squadrons were notoriously undermanned and poorly trained, suitable only for anti-submarine patrol work. Nishizawa and his fellow pilots approached their mission with the calm confidence of professionals facing amateurs. As they crossed the coastline of Samar and the American ships came into view on the horizon, Nishizawa began counting the small silhouettes. On escort carrier 2-3, he counted 6 in total, arranged in a defensive formation his instructors had mockingly called the prayer circle, a formation so vulnerable that it was taught as an example of what never to do. But then his radio crackled with a transmission from his squadron leader, and the calm voice contained a note of confusion Nishizawa had never heard before. Multiple contacts rising. Many contacts. Where are they all coming from? What Nishizawa saw in the next 60 seconds would shake his understanding of American industrial capability to its core. From the flight decks of those 6 small carriers, aircraft were launching in a continuous stream that seemed to defy the laws of physics and naval architecture. One plane cleared the deck, then another, with intervals so short that Nishizawa initially thought he was seeing the same aircraft circling. But no, these were different planes, an endless flow lifting off into the tropical sky. His training told him that each escort carrier could hold perhaps 15 to 20 aircraft. With 6 carriers, he should be facing a maximum of perhaps 120 American planes. He began counting, and when he reached 70 aircraft with no end to the launch in sight, he stopped counting. His mind simply couldn't process what his eyes were reporting. The doctrine he'd trusted, the intelligence he'd believed, had just been proven catastrophically wrong. And then those American aircraft did something else that shattered his expectations. They didn't fly in the defensive, cautious patterns of green pilots protecting their ships. They came straight at his formation with the aggressive tactics of fleet carrier veterans. Here is where we must reveal the secret that Japanese intelligence never uncovered. The transformation that had occurred inside those unremarkable-looking escort carriers. Beginning in early 1944, the United States Navy had quietly implemented a radical change in how these ships were used. Instead of filling them with replacement pilots and obsolete aircraft, the Navy began assigning them full combat squadrons, flying the latest models of the F-6F Hellcat and the TBM Avenger, the same aircraft that flew from the big fleet carriers. More importantly, they began rotating veteran pilots from the fleet carriers to the escort carriers to serve as squadron leaders and training officers. These weren't rear echelon forces anymore. They were frontline combat units that happened to operate from smaller platforms. And because the escort carriers were so numerous, they could be concentrated in ways the precious fleet carriers could not. That morning off Samar, those 6 escort carriers had launched more than 250 aircraft, more than the entire Japanese carrier fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. But Lieutenant Nishizawa didn't know any of this historical context as he pushed his stick forward and dove into the developing dogfight. He only knew that nothing about this battle matched what he'd been promised. The fight that followed lasted less than 40 minutes. But the action was so intense that survivors would later describe it as collapsing time itself. Nishizawa was an experienced pilot, a veteran of campaigns from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands, and he shot down 2 American aircraft in the opening minutes. But for every American plane that fell, 2 more seemed to appear. His squadron mates were calling out warnings in increasingly desperate voices. And Nishizawa noticed something else disturbing. The American pilots weren't just numerous, they were skilled. Their gunnery was precise, their formation flying was tight, and their tactical coordination suggested they were communicating through a level of radio discipline that Japanese pilots had been told Americans were too individualistic to maintain. When Nishizawa's wingman took hits and began trailing smoke, an American fighter didn't just attack, it anticipated his evasive turn and was waiting there with guns ready. This was the discipline of training, repeated thousands of times in exercises that Japan no longer had the fuel or time to conduct. And then, Just as Nishizawa managed to disengage and climb for altitude, he witnessed something that struck him as almost theatrical in its display of American abundance. A fresh wave of aircraft was rising from the escort carriers below, not replacements for losses, but an entirely new strike group that had been prepared while the first wave was engaging. Nishizawa's formation was down to 11 aircraft. He was low on ammunition and fuel was becoming a concern. The Americans were cycling in reinforcements as if drawing from an infinite supply. His squadron leader's voice came over the radio, and this time it wasn't confused. It was defeated. The order was simple: break off and return to the carrier. As Nishizawa turned for home, he looked back at the American formation one last time. Those boxy little escort carriers were still steaming in their circle, and planes were still rising from their decks, a continuous production line of aerial warfare. He had been taught that industrial might meant building bigger ships and more powerful guns. What he was witnessing was something his instructors had never imagined. Industrial might meant building adequate ships in overwhelming numbers and filling them with quality that matched any elite force. The implications were terrifying. Of the 18 aircraft that had launched with him that morning, only 7 returned to Zuikaku. The others had been shot down or were missing, lost to fuel starvation while trying to find their carrier. When Nishizawa climbed down from his cockpit, his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the cognitive shock of having his worldview shattered in less than an hour. In the debriefing room, he tried to explain what he'd seen. The sheer numbers, the unexpected skill, the endless waves of aircraft from ships that weren't supposed to matter. The intelligence officer listened with a face that grew progressively paler, then asked the question that would define the rest of the Pacific War. If those small carriers can do this, what happens when their big carriers arrive? The answer, of course, was that it didn't matter. The escort carriers alone were enough. Over the next 3 days, the Battle of Leyte Gulf would become the largest naval engagement in history, and those supposedly negligible escort carriers would fly more than 1,600 combat sorties, more than the entire Japanese naval air force could muster from all its remaining carriers combined. But the true measure of the shock wasn't visible in the battle statistics. It was recorded in the personal writings of Japanese naval officers in the weeks that followed. Captain Toshikazu Omae, a staff officer who survived the battle, wrote in his diary an entry that was only discovered decades later. "We were told America was a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers who couldn't fight. But today, I watched factory workers turn merchant ships into weapons that swept our finest pilots from the sky. If their inferior ships can do this, what does inferior even mean?" Admiral Kurita, who commanded the surface fleet that day, wrote in his post-war memoir about the moment he realized the battle was lost. It wasn't when his battleships came under attack. It wasn't when his cruiser was sunk. It was when he looked up and saw wave after wave of aircraft overhead and understood they were all coming from carriers his intelligence had told him to ignore. He wrote, "We had been fighting the wrong war. We planned to sink their best ships. We never imagined they would bury us with their worst ones." The escort carrier revolution wasn't really about the ships themselves. It was about a fundamental difference in how two nations understood the word enough. Japanese naval doctrine, forged in an island nation with limited resources, prized quality above all else. Every ship was precious. Every pilot was trained to near perfection over years of careful instruction, and every weapon was crafted to be superior to its enemy equivalent. This wasn't a flaw. It was a rational response to scarcity. But America had approached the war from the opposite direction. The question American planners asked wasn't, how do we build the perfect carrier? It was, how do we build enough carriers fast enough to be everywhere at once? The escort carriers were deliberately designed to be good enough, not the fastest, not the most heavily armed, not the most glamorous, but adequate for the mission and producible in numbers that would overwhelm any opponent. When you could build one every 5 days, losing one wasn't a strategic catastrophe. It was an acceptable cost of operations. And this philosophy, this willingness to mass-produce adequacy, was something Japanese strategic thinking had no framework to counter. In the years after the war, Lieutenant Nishizawa survived to become a commercial pilot. In a 1962 interview with a Japanese aviation magazine, he was asked what moment from the war had affected him most deeply. His answer wasn't about the friends he'd lost or the battles he'd survived. He said, "It was flying back to my carrier that October morning and looking down at the ocean, thinking about all the ships America must have built that we'd never even seen, all the pilots they'd trained that we'd never encounter, and realizing that somewhere in America, even while I was flying, they were building more. They were always building more. We were fighting until we could fight no more. They were building until they ran out of ocean to put ships in. Those are not the same thing." The escort carriers of the United States Navy would go on to fly more than 70,000 combat sorties in the Pacific War. They would sink dozens of submarines, support hundreds of amphibious landings, and provide air cover for thousands of merchant ships. But perhaps their greatest achievement was psychological. They broke the Japanese Navy's faith in its own intelligence, its own doctrine, and ultimately its own ability to predict what America could do. After Leyte Gulf, Japanese planning documents began including phrases like assume unlimited American resources and prepare for numerical superiority in all categories. These weren't assessments, they were admissions of defeat. The war would continue for another 10 months. But the strategic confidence that had launched Japan into the conflict had been destroyed off the coast of Samar by ships that reconnaissance photographs had marked as negligible. Sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't the one you fear. It's the one you were taught to ignore, arriving in numbers you were told were impossible, crewed by people you were promised couldn't fight. And by the time you realize you were lied to, the sky is already full of them, and there's nowhere left to run.